Okay, I was thinking the other day, as you do, about the issue of how people actually record electric guitar. There's two typical approaches. One, close miking the speaker cabinet, and I guess the other, more increasingly common approach these days with people doing home recording is direct injection, DI basically, sort of bypassing the cabinet altogether. Now the issue that came to my mind just out of the blue was, fundamentally that's going to be problematic in terms of reproducing the way a speaker cabinet actually sounds, or a guitar played through a speaker cabinet actually sounds. And the fundamental problem for both cases, more so in the DI'd case, but even in the typical mic'd speaker cabinet case, is the lack of a significant contribution to the overall sound of the sound coming out of the back of the speaker cabinet. Because typically, not so much, well, definitely isn't the case for bass guitar cabinet, but normal 6-string electric guitar cabinet, the typical arrangement is you have a driver mounted in a box, but the back of the box is actually open to the environment, so you get a strong contribution to the overall sound from the back of the speaker as well as the front of the speaker. And you've got that 180 degree or anti-phase relationship between the sound coming out of the back and the sound coming out of the front. So if you actually end up close miking that arrangement, that speaker cabinet, which I see quite often, like you have basically a microphone that's sitting centimeters, or inches if you like, away from the main driver of the speaker cabinet, or drivers if it's got more than one. Whether it's centrally aligned or slightly off to the side or whatever, it is largely irrelevant. But if you look at the fact that the proximity, the microphone to the loudspeaker is maybe, let's say, 3 or 4 centimeters, 5 centimeters, and then you consider the distance from the rear of the speaker around the outside of the cabinet to the microphone, the ratio of those two differences basically governs what the the sound pressure level contribution ratio is between the front of the cabinet and the rear of the cabinet. So the distance that it's going to go from the rear of the cabinet around to the front of the loudspeaker is going to be quite significant. Instead of, say, 2 or 3 centimeters, if it's right next to the front of the cabinet, you're probably looking at, depending on the size of the cabinet, anywhere from, I don't know, 30 or 20, 30 centimeters to, if it's a really large speaker cabinet, maybe 50 or 50 centimeters or something like that. So it's a substantial factor. So in practice, what the microphone in front of the loudspeaker cabinet is picking up from the rear is probably going to be anywhere in the order of 10 to 30 dB below whatever it's picking up from the front. So it's essentially the contribution from the rear of the cabinet is almost non-existent. Whereas you as a performer of that guitar, if you look at the relative distances between the front and the rear of the cabinet, they're going to be almost parity because you're going to be a meter or more away from the loudspeaker. So what you hear is a fairly equal contribution from the rear and the front of the speaker cabinet, which is a completely different scenario. Likewise, if you're doing a DI'd rendition of the guitar, then the speaker cabinet doesn't come into it at all. And I can't vouch for what cabinet modeling plugins do. I have no idea how they've modeled them, but if they've actually modeled them on the typical way that cabinets get recorded, which is close mic proximity to the front of the cabinet, they too won't be picking up the effect of the antiphase component coming from the rear to the front. So potentially they're going to suffer from the exact same scenario, and definitely will suffer from the same scenario if you're not using any cabinet modeling plugin whatsoever. So if so basically the thought I came up with then was that for any in particular in the case of the mixes that I've done of TSA and their particular guitar sound, for a lot of the recordings I've never been 100% satisfied with the way they sound, and this explanation seems to tally with, oh look, here's my dog, one of my dogs, tally with my understanding of, oh there's the other one, Pushkin and Piper. Doesn't tally with what I was expecting them to sound like. So the, and it looks like Pushkin's looking at himself. So yeah, I was just experimenting with this in this approach to see what effect it might have, and I can explain this further. So I'll give a visual illustration of what I'm actually referring to. I just need to change my screens. What is going on here? That's better. So let's see. Yes, I'll minimize this. I don't want this in. Hang on. Minimize that. Right. So, for example, okay, let's just do a rather dodgy looking sketch of what's going on here. So I know this is tedious, but drawing with a mouse is pretty hard. So this is our fictitious speaker cabinet. Maybe I'll change color to yellow. So typically somebody will put a microphone right in front of it. Oh, just got knocked by my dog. So there's our microphone. So you can see if I do, say, in red, you've got this very short distance of propagation from the loudspeaker to the microphone. But you've also got a contribution from the rear which comes around the front and again through there. So now if you compare the length of those two lines, you can see this path is way longer than that path. So as a consequence, the sound pressure arriving from the rear is much lower than the sound pressure arriving from the front, because it basically the volume falls on a 1 on R, where R is the distance, basis. So basically, if I call, say, this distance here the front distance, and this distance here the rear distance, then the ratio of the front to rear sound pressure is going to be F on R. So you're going to see that it's going to be dominated by, because R is going to be in terms of, yeah, if we basically the contribution of the rear is going to be this ratio compared with the front. So basically, if this number is really small and this number is really large, you can see it's going to be a very substantial drop in amplitude of the rear contribution to the front contribution. Whereas if I was a listener, say I might be standing here, let's just do a stick man. Here's your stick man. So now in this case, you've got this distance, and then you've got this distance, and now you see the two distances are getting comparable. There's not going to be that much difference between the two, and the further you are away, the closer that ratio becomes to 1. So the closer it becomes parity between the front and the rear of the speaker cabinet. And yeah, as I said, like when the front of the loudspeaker is going forward, in terms of what's coming out of the rear, it looks like it's going backwards. So the sound that comes out of the rear is anti-phase to the sound that's coming out of the front. So the consequence of that is it's going to alter the tonal character substantially compared with what you hear, compared with what a microphone picks up. It's going to be substantially different. Now, if we put that into practice, I can get rid of this now, and I have to get out of this application, activate that one. So here's a simple example that I have. It's just an extract of a single guitar part taken from one of those TSA concerts that I've remixed. And if you look at what I've done here, I've basically got, here's my raw guitar track. It's going to two targets. One of the targets is the output bus, and the other target is my effects channel. And you'll see why, because basically in my effects channel, I've got a monophonic delay, which is this plugin here. All it's doing is delaying it by, in this case, 0.6 milliseconds. And I've also done this slight attenuation of high frequency here, basically to sort of account for the fact that when the sound waves propagating around the cabinet will actually be attenuated at a high frequency, and it's not an accurate model. You get two sources of attenuation. You get basically the distance factor, which I was talking about before, because they're not going to be exactly the same. One distance is going to be shorter than the other for a real listening case, except in the really far field it'll be very close to parity. But you also get high frequency attenuation owing to the fact that the loudspeaker itself is not a point source, it's a sizable source. So basically the path is not a single delay but a range of delays, because it's radiating from points across the entire the entire diaphragm, so you'll get a range of delays. So in effect, it's not a single delay; it's an aggregation of basically like a window. What's the typical explanation of it? Well, in terms of an impulse response, it's like a window. How can I guess I can illustrate that again. For instance, let's pretend this is my baffle, right? Got a baffle here. I've got a fictitious driver here that moves in and out, right? It's got this diameter, but it's we're just saying it's a flat diaphragm for simplicity. So if I have a listening point here out in the distance, if I'm on axis, basically you're getting the contribution of sound from there. See, all along the surface of the loudspeaker, basically to that one point. And you can see that these distances are going to be, like, the further you get away from the loudspeaker, they all basically coalesce to be approximately the same length. But if now I move off to the side out here, you can see that there's now a substantial difference in the distance between, say, this contribution from this end to the contribution of this end. And that's what actually gives rise to the polar response of a loudspeaker, basically. So if you wanted to make a loudspeaker that was good at radiating in all directions, you basically want a point source. But the wider it is, the more directional it becomes. So because of that. Because if I looked at that in, well, let's clear that. If I looked at that in the time domain, in terms of an impulse response, you basically have this sort of situation. In one case, when you're on axis, you might have an impulse response that looks like it's a fairly narrow width, owing to the difference, like for on axis, the difference between the contribution of one side of the cone to the middle of the cone. So you've got this impulse that looks like that, but then if you go off axis, it's suddenly going to look maybe like this. So you see it gets wider, and as a consequence of that, you get this frequency response alteration. So you'd probably end up with a frequency response of something that looks like, if I remember correctly, doing something like this, where this cutoff, the main cutoff here, is related to how wide this pulse is. So that's why, basically why, if for a large driver, if it's a perfect driver and it doesn't actually break up, as in it. My dog's just hassling me again. Go away, Pushkin. Excuse me. Go on. Out you go. Out. He's basically angling for a WALK. Oh, he's still sitting there. Well, you just sit there then. What was I saying? Come on, out. That's the root cause of the polar response of a loudspeaker, because if it's acting as a solid body and not flexing, not having wave propagation across the surface of the driver, you'll get this roll-off. It'll be more pronounced off axis than it is on axis because of the width of this contribution in the impulse response. So that's a sufficient explanation for why I've actually, probably over sufficient explanation of why I've actually got this frequency alteration here. They're really desperate for a WALK, I can see. But anyway, I'm going to finish this before I take them anywhere. So that's basically the effect now, or the modeling. So it's a simplified model because a more simplified, a more realistic model would have a range of time delays, not just a single time delay. But now if I actually play this back between the two, toggle between the two, you can hear what alteration it makes. And I guess the other thing I'll do is I shall put it on the output bus and put this in view so that you can see what effect it has on the actual spectrum. So if I were to play this, currently you can see I've got my rear of the cabinet contribution switched off. So it's like the typical way of recording, which is close miking at the front of the cabinet. And as far as I'm aware, that's how this was recorded, but I've also equalized it to make it more uniform. But here we go. So the question is, which do you prefer? Me personally, I much prefer the one with the contribution from the rear of the cabinet coming through. Specifically, what you'll note is you get an attenuation of the low frequencies, which is what you'd expect, because at low frequencies, the lower you go, the closer what's coming out of the rear and the front have minimal effect on the phase of the contributions, and those contributions are anti-phase. So basically, as you approach 0 hertz frequency, those two sources, the front and the rear, are perfectly anti-phase, almost perfectly anti-phase. They're not perfectly anti-phase as you increase the frequency, because the 0.6 millisecond time delay difference shifts the phase slightly. But how much it shifts relative to the periodicity of the waveform is obviously frequency dependent. So for really low frequencies, its period is really long. So for instance, let's say 50 hertz has a period of 20 milliseconds, I think. So adding 0.6 milliseconds to a sinusoid that has a period of 20 milliseconds is not much of a phase shift. It's barely nothing, so it's still almost completely anti-phase. Whereas if you're at a much higher frequency, say 10 times that, then it's 10 times smaller. So instead of 50 hertz, we're talking about 500 hertz, then the period is 2 milliseconds. So 2 milliseconds is much closer in proximity to 0.6 milliseconds. You know, it's about, I guess it's about a third of a period. So that's a substantial phase shift. So it's going to have less of an effect. So if you were actually looking at this spectrograph while I was switching, you would have noticed that there was, I can actually draw it on there, that's what I'll do. If I go back to this, if I was to illustrate what the sort of frequency response would be doing, it would be something like this. So there's definitely, there's a notch that appears around about here. Let's see, and a notch that appears around about here. So I'll only draw a couple of them. So there'll be a notch here, a notch here, and then essentially a notch there. Something like that, on account of that particular time delay. Now basically if I increase that time delay, I'll get more notches basically. So, but I specifically chose this one, and the reason why I specifically chose this one, actually, to be able to illustrate that, I'll have to just quickly go online. No, I don't want that. No, I don't want that. Let's see. And I've got my internet turned off. So, but if I do a search for what do I want to search for? Equal loudness contours of pure tones. I've done it before. Oh, there you go. I can go to the Wikipedia page. So if you note, each of these lines represents the equal loudness contour of perceived sound. This doesn't look like a one for pure tones. It actually looks more like one that's carried out for say band filtered noise, but I'm not sure what the bandwidth is. You'd have to look at what the definition of ISO 226 is to figure that one out. But you'll note that right here, this is 3 kilohertz. So 1, 2, 3 kilohertz. There's a natural dip here. And what does that mean? Because it's low, it means your hearing is very sensitive here. So it's substantially more sensitive than it is here at half of that frequency, which is about 1.5 kilohertz. So you got 1.5 kilohertz peak there and a 3 kilohertz dip there. So if you look back at what I actually did in, oh dear, it's a bit hard to navigate this thing. Oh, is it still showing? Let's see. No, I've cleared it. So basically, the way I've chosen my delay, which is 0.6 milliseconds, it actually should have been about 0.65, but this particular plugin will not let me, oh God, I hate that, will not let me adjust it to that resolution. It only seems to be wanting to set it to 0.1 millisecond intervals. So ideally it should have been about 0.65 milliseconds. And the reason why I chose that is because if you do that, you get basically a peak. Oh, gee. Oh, sorry. Where's it gone? I didn't want to be adjusting the output. I was trying to, let's get rid of that. I needed to select this first. I was trying to put a peak here and a trough here. That's not exactly how it should look. The way it's basically, it's a sinusoid, the shape of the frequency response with that arrangement. It's basically a sine wave, but it's taking the log of a sine wave to convert it into decibels, and because of that you end up with something that looks like, whoops, no, that's not what I wanted. Something that looks like what was it? Something that looks like that, basically. So that was the whole point of choosing that particular time delay interval, and that to me explains why it actually sounds particularly good. It sounds like, if I wanted to explain how I felt about it, it sounds like it has more clarity than the original, without the contribution from the rear. So what happens if I choose a different time delay? Well, I can illustrate that to you right now. If I go back to my Cubase, so instead, if I were to choose double that, which would be 1.2 milliseconds, you can see what happens. So basically 1.2 milliseconds will still have a notch at 3 kilohertz, but it'll have a further notch further down in frequency, probably, well, we'll see when I play it back. So if I play this variety back, so basically with that, you could see that there was notching around this, I don't know, somewhere in between this 501 kilohertz range, owing to the fact that we've doubled that. So we've doubled the number of notches that appear by increasing the time delay. And with that, it definitely takes on a character that sounds more like flanging. So you definitely hear this lower or upper, lower mid-range or coloration because of it. So in that case, it doesn't actually sound as good. Whereas if I again go back to this 0.6, that low mid-range notch disappears because it's occurring, the first notching occurs at about 1.5 kilohertz, I think. Oh, actually no, at 3 kilohertz. Oh no, about 1.5. So alternatively, so that's got a notch at about 1.5, and it's also got a notch at 3 kilohertz. So if I reduce that even more, what happens then? Now let's take it back a bit. Definitely to my ear, the one I prefer most is the one that is 0.6 milliseconds basically, or thereabouts. And why 0.6 milliseconds? Let's have a look. If you got, what was the frequency of interest? Okay, that's right. Like the speed of sound, it's 345 meters per second. And oh no, I don't even want to worry about that. That's converting it into distances. Basically, I was trying to get get a notch at 3 kilohertz. And the first notch, because it's antiphase, the first notch is going to be at 0 hertz, and then it's going to be at the frequency at which the phase alteration from the rear, from the rear path to wherever the sound is being picked up is going to be in phase. So it's going to be one period of whatever the frequency of interest is. So the period of 3000 hertz is basically the inverse of that. So it's 3.3 milliseconds. So that was the first case. So I'm choosing 6.6 milliseconds, which actually means the first notch is going to be at 1 kilohertz. That's the one that actually sounds best to me. If I refer back to this, I suppose there is a bit of a, you can see there's a bit, for the 1 kilohertz case, there is a bit of a weakness there. It's not as strong. So you see 3 kilohertz and 1 kilohertz. So the case I was choosing has notching at around about 1 kilohertz and notching at 3 kilohertz. And that to me is why it actually sounds best, because it actually matches the sound pressure level characteristic of, it complements the sound pressure sensitivity of human hearing. So yeah, that's essentially the observation that I wanted to point out, and I'm somewhat tempted in actually creating a simple plugin to actually implement this, and potentially making it a free plugin. But it's an interesting observation. Let me know what you think, whether you like it, with the simulated rear of the cabinet contribution, or whether you prefer it raw from the front. The other thing I'd point out as well is this particular observation has implications in how you might design a speaker cabinet for a electric guitar loudspeaker, basically. So as far as I'm concerned, it should be designed in such a way that when listening to it from the front, the contribution from the rear of the cabinet is about 0.6 milliseconds behind what is coming out of the front, and then it's likely to give an optimal timbre, if you like, colour. So there's my 2 cents worth on designing a guitar loudspeaker cabinet, and I'm tempted to actually try that one out as well. But you can see that there's potential complications in how you might actually design such a thing, because obviously the bigger the driver that you're using in your loudspeaker cabinet, the bigger the overall cabinet, and consequently the bigger the delay from the rear to the front. But I guess even with a large diameter guitar speaker, you could probably engineer by putting holes in the front of the baffles a path length that's close to that 0.1 millisecond ideal, as far as I'm concerned, is an ideal, to get that overall response character. So it's it's an interesting design exercise, but I'll leave it at that.